This week on the Esther Krakue Show.
The state says these people are too dangerous to remain at liberty. You can't deport someone unless another country will receive them. So the longer the state fails, the stronger the claim to remain becomes, and nothing gets resolved. Over time, that produces a kind of democratic fatigue. So what is the answer? Why do Western countries struggle to deport foreign criminals? There's something about this issue that drives people absolutely mad, and I can understand why. Western governments can tax you down to the last penny. They can fine you, regulate you, monitor you, summon you, arrest you, prosecute you, and imprison you. They can tell you what you can build, what paperwork you need, how many forms to fill, and what deadlines matter. They can build vast bureaucracies to administer every corner of your life. But somehow, when it comes to deporting non-citizens who've committed serious crimes, suddenly the mighty modern state becomes hesitant, sluggish, and oddly powerless. That's one of the reasons this issue has become so politically explosive. It's not just about migration. It's not even just about crime. It's about whether the state can still do something basic and comprehensible. Decide that a non-citizen who has committed serious offences should leave, and then actually make that happen. Across Europe, governments have become increasingly candid about the fact they do not think the current system is working. In May 2025, 9 European countries, led by Italy and Denmark, called for easier expulsion of foreign criminals, arguing that the European Court of Human Rights had interpreted the convention in ways that protected the wrong people and unduly restricted national discretion. Reuters reported that the signatories wanted a rethink because they believed the balance had shifted too far away from public safety and democratic control. And they're speaking into a wider atmosphere of political distrust. Data published by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD for short, in 2025 showed that across member countries, just 39% of people reported high or moderately high trust in national government in 2023, while 44% reported low or no trust. The same OECD material showed that only 40% of people felt they had a say in what government does, which is a useful measure of how detached many voters already feel from political decision-making. Now that matters because this subject has become one of the clearest ways people judge whether the people in charge mean what they say. If the state can't remove foreign criminals it has already decided should go, then every speech about control starts to sound decorative. Now, before going any further, it's also worth making one thing clear. This isn't really about all migrants or all asylum seekers or everyone who entered illegally. Those are separate arguments. This issue is more specific. It's about foreign national offenders and other non-citizens whose removal is blocked, delayed, or never carried out even after the state has concluded that they should be deported. Once you narrow it down that way, you can see why public anger is so often intense. The fury usually comes after the state has already said, in effect, yes, this person should be removed. The scandal is that removal often doesn't happen at all. The public case is very easy to understand. If you're not a citizen and you commit serious crimes in the country that admitted you, many people think you've broken the most basic bargain and trust. That's not some fringe instinct, it's perfectly mainstream. It reflects a simple moral intuition that citizenship should mean something and that residency is not supposed to be a one-way arrangement in which the host country owes you everything even after repeated criminality. So why is it so hard? Part of the answer is that deportation is not just a plane ticket. A state may want to remove someone, but first it must establish identity, secure travel documents, find a receiving country, avoid breaching domestic and international law, manage detention, survive appeal after appeal, and sometimes deal with a home country that simply doesn't want its own citizen back. Once you put all of that together, you start to see the shape of the problem. The first major obstacle is the non-refoulement principle, and in Europe, Article 3 protections against torture and inhumane or degrading treatment. Now on paper, this isn't controversial. Most people would agree that government shouldn't deport people into torture chambers or death traps. The difficulty comes when this principle expands into a much wider practical shield. The state doesn't owe a convicted foreign criminal or an illegal immigrant the same loyalty it owes its citizens. But according to international law, it still has certain legal duties towards them. It can't simply send people to places where they're likely to be tortured, killed, or subjected to inhumane treatment. And in some cases, courts also weigh family ties and private life built up in the host country. The British government's 2025 Asylum and Returns Policy Statement argued that these protections, especially broad readings of Article 3, along with late modern slavery referrals, had increasingly been used to frustrate removals. The same statement said that more than 2 in 5 people detained for return between January and September 2022 had been referred into the modern slavery system, often after detention had already begun. This is where a lot of the public exasperation comes from. People can accept, however reluctantly, that they're genuine hard cases. What they struggle to accept is a system that looks as if it can turn almost any vulnerability, any risk, any procedural claim into another reason nothing happens. Then there's Article 8 and the whole question of family life. This is probably the most politically combustible part of the debate because it sounds humane in the abstract and maddening in practice. British ministers have argued that Article 8 has been used to delay deportation by foreign criminals and that the concept of family life has stretched too far beyond the immediate nuclear family in what they see as looser and more opportunistic connections. Reuters reported in November 2025 that the British government planned to legislate to change how domestic courts interpret the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically in order to deport more foreign criminals and restrict the use of family life arguments. The reason this lands so badly with voters is that it creates the impression that the state defeats itself. It allows someone to remain for years while appeals grind on, during which time deeper ties are formed, and then those very ties are used to argue that deportation would now be disproportionate. At this point, the ordinary person looks at the whole exercise and thinks, so the longer the state fails, the stronger the claim to remain becomes. That's not a crazy reaction. It's a rational response to a system that often rewards delay. There's another problem too, one that gets less attention than the legal arguments, but is often decisive. You can't deport someone unless another country will receive them. If the home state drags its feet on identity documents, denies nationality, or simply refuses cooperation, the deporting country can find itself stuck. Britain's 2025 proposals included visa restrictions for countries such as Angola, Namibia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo because, according to ministers, they had shown unacceptably low cooperation and obstructed return processes. That's an important reminder that border control is not solely a domestic matter. It depends on diplomacy, leverage, and the willingness of other states to play along. Once you start looking abroad, the whole thing becomes even more revealing. Australia offers one of the most extraordinary examples. In 2023, the High Court ruled that indefinite immigration detention was unlawful, forcing the release of 83 foreigners, including people convicted of crimes such as murder and sexual assault, because they couldn't lawfully be locked up forever if removal was not realistically possible. Reuters reported that this triggered a major political backlash and forced the government to rush through restrictions and new legislation. Later reporting noted that roughly 150 people, including refugees and stateless individuals, were affected by the principle because they were similarly unlikely to be deported. Now think about what that means in plain English. The state says these people are too dangerous to remain at liberty. The court says you can't detain them forever. Their home countries either will not take them or there are legal barriers to sending them back. So what is the answer? Release them into the community under various conditions or search for more offshore workarounds. That's not order, that's improvisation under judicial pressure. By 2025, Australia had moved toward one of the strangest workarounds in the democratic world. Reuters reported in September that it had passed a law to speed deportations of non-citizens to third countries, paving the way for hundreds of refugees denied visas because of criminal convictions to be sent to Nauru. Reuters also reported that Australia had agreed to pay Nauru $2.5 billion over 30 years to host deported non-citizens. In other words, one wealthy Western democracy found itself paying a tiny Pacific island state to solve a removal problem it couldn't solve at home. That is exactly the kind of thing that shatters public confidence because it tells citizens that ordinary deportation has become so difficult that governments are pushed into bizarre and expensive substitute arrangements. The United States provides a different version of the same dysfunction. Reuters reported in July 2025 that the Trump administration had sent third country deportees to Eswatini in southern Africa after the Supreme Court lifted limits on such removals. According to the Department of Homeland Security, some of these men had committed crimes ranging from child rape to murder and were described as so uniquely barbaric that their home countries would not take them back. Eswatini itself then said it was holding 5 of these deportees in isolated prison units while it sought to repatriate them onward. Again, step back and look at the wider picture. If your ordinary deportation system worked properly, you wouldn't need to fly people across continents into ad hoc arrangements with third countries that are then left trying to work out what to do with them. This is what happens when a state can no longer turn legal authority into straightforward physical removal. It reaches for spectacle. France is perhaps the best European example of how this issue fuels political resentment, even when removals rise. Reuters reported in February 2025 that France deported around 22,000 migrants living illegally in the country in 2024, a 27% increase on the previous year, and that the government openly welcomed the rise as it tried to stave off Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party. Then in April, Reuters published a deeper investigation showing how heated the politics had become around unexecuted deportation orders and the expulsion of long-settled non-citizens after legal protections had been narrowed. The reporting described the issue as a red-hot debate, with the far right presenting state weakness over deportations as proof that mainstream politicians are incapable of defending the country's borders or applying their own rules. That is important because it shows that politics doesn't calm down simply because numbers go up. Once this issue becomes symbolic, it's not about annual totals. It's about whether the state looks serious, coherent, and in control, something which ends up compromising the overall motivation of that government. A government can deport more people than before and still look weak if enough salient cases remain unresolved and enough members of the public think the underlying system is absurd. Germany offers another clear illustration. Reuters reported in April 2025 that migration was the most disputed issue in coalition negotiations and that the incoming government agreed measures aimed at curbing illegal migration, including deporting asylum seekers at borders, enabling deportations to Syria, and suspending family reunions. Earlier, Reuters reporting said the outgoing government was touting fewer asylum claims and increased deportations, while pressure from the far-right Alternative for Germany Party, or AfD, remained intense. The pattern is hard to miss here. Mainstream parties move late, speak more sharply than before, and then tighten policy only after the issue has already become electorally dangerous. The Netherlands shows how far this can go. Reuters reported in June 2025 that Geert Wilders quit the Dutch governing coalition because other parties would not fully back his tougher immigration plans, causing the government to collapse. Another Reuters piece described Wilders as gambling that a snap election focused on immigration would bring him greater success. Whether you like Wilders or not is besides the point. The point is that unresolved frustration over migration and enforcement becomes the fuel on which this sort of politics runs. And the data across Europe only deepens the sense that the machine is not doing what it says on the tin. Eurostat reported that in the third quarter of 2025, 115,440 non-EU citizens were ordered to leave an EU country, but only 34,155 people were returned to third countries following such an order. The gap is startling. It means that the paperwork of expulsion is generated on a much larger scale than expulsion itself. And that right there is a perfect recipe for cynicism. Politicians announce crackdowns, governments issue orders, interior ministers give stern speeches, then a much smaller number of actual returns follows. At some point, the public notices that there's a large space between what is declared and what's actually delivered. Canada is less theatrical than some of these cases, but in a way, it's even more useful because it shows the bureaucracy laid bare. The Canada Border Services Agency states that it's legally obliged to remove inadmissible persons as quickly as possible, but its own published statistics include a removal not possible inventory for people who cannot currently be removed because of things such as pending federal court appeals, criminal charges, pre-removal risk assessments, or prison sentences, as well as a wanted inventory for people who fail to appear for removal proceedings. Those categories run into the many thousands. That is the modern deportation problem in one image. Not a clean line between here and gone, but a vast grey zone full of appeals, absconders, suspended removals, risk assessments, and procedural limbo. And this is where the political consequences come in, and they are serious. When voters see governments unable to remove non-citizens convicted of serious crimes, they don't just form an opinion about immigration law. They form an opinion about the entire governing class. They start to think that the people in charge either can't do basic things or don't really want to. They see legal and bureaucratic systems that feel elaborate when applied to ordinary citizens and strangely ineffective when applied to outsiders who've committed grave offences. That perception becomes corrosive very, very quickly. It inflames social tensions because every especially egregious case becomes more than an isolated case. It becomes a symbol. It stands in for a wider grievance that rules are strict for the compliant and endlessly negotiable for everybody else. It feeds the sense that elites care more about processes than outcomes and more about abstract rights language than the moral intuitions of the public. That's one reason immigration arguments in Europe no longer stay confined to immigration. They spill into arguments about fairness, belonging, public order, and national identity. It also helps explain why harder right parties grow even when mainstream parties finally try to sound tougher. If voters conclude that the centre has had years to get a grip and failed, then belated promises sound opportunistic rather than convincing. Reuters' coverage in 2025 repeatedly linked tougher government rhetoric on migration and deportation to pressure from parties to the right, whether in France, Germany, or the Netherlands. That doesn't mean deportation failure single-handedly created the far right. Politics is never that simple. But visible state weakness on a question this visceral gives such parties an incredibly powerful message. The people in charge can't even remove foreign criminals they themselves say should leave. And then there's disillusion. Not everyone turns to the right. Some people simply stop believing. They watch the cycle repeat itself over and over again. Outrage, promise, legal challenge, delay, review, appeal, another speech, another promise, and nothing gets resolved. Over time, that produces a kind of democratic fatigue. If the state can't follow through on something as visible and as morally straightforward as deporting serious foreign offenders, why should anyone believe it will get anything else right? This is where the deportation issue becomes much bigger than deportation itself. It turns into a referendum on whether liberal democratic states still have the confidence to enforce membership boundaries at all. Modern Western governments are perfectly comfortable with the language of punishment when they're jailing people. Prison feels procedural. It feels tidy. But deportation is different. Deportation forces a state to say that membership matters, that not everybody belongs on the same terms, and that citizenship is not just an administrative detail. A great many political and legal elites are much less comfortable saying that plainly. So instead of clarity, you get balancing tests. Instead of decisiveness, you get prolonged case-by-case hesitation. And instead of a hard border, you get an ever-thickening fog of expectations, views, and obligations. Now, to be fair, there are real hard cases. Some people genuinely would face torture or death if they were returned. Some people were brought as children and barely know the country to which they're supposedly being sent. Some do have families whose lives will be profoundly disrupted by expulsion. Some governments are lazy, performative, and reckless, and would like to bulldoze through due process whenever it's politically convenient. All of that is true. But it's also true that a system cannot be judged only by its hardest edge cases. It must also be judged by what it looks and feels like in the round. And in the round, the current system in many Western countries looks chaotic, slow, self-defeating, and politically ruinous. It's convinced millions of voters the state can no longer perform a core sovereign function without disappearing into legal abstraction and bureaucratic delay. And that's why this issue keeps coming back. It keeps coming back because it touches something more profound than immigration policy. It touches whether the public still believes that their government means what it says and can do what it promises. Western countries struggle to deport criminals because they built systems that pull in opposite directions. They want open-ended rights review and visible border control. They want humanitarian obligations that are morally serious, but they also want removal to be quick, clean, and politically reassuring. They want the prestige that comes with universal principles while still promising voters that national membership means something concrete. In practice, that makes it unstable. It produces a state that's forever announcing control and forever discovering fresh reasons why control can't quite be exercised. That doesn't mean governments are powerless. They could narrow the scope for endless appeals. They could tighten the interpretation of family life claims. They could make deportation automatic for a wider category of serious offenders. They could use visa sanctions, trade leverage, foreign aid conditionality, and diplomatic pressure against countries that refuse to take back their own nationals. They could speed up identity verification and expand detention capacity where lawful, and even stop allowing delay itself to become a route to settlement. Now, none of this would remove every hard case, and it really shouldn't. But it would at least tell the public that the state still intends to enforce the distinction between citizen and non-citizen and guest and member. And if governments won't even do that, the political consequences will continue. Trust will erode further, social tensions will worsen, harder right movements will keep feeding on the sense that the mainstream either can't or won't act. More voters will conclude that the whole thing is theatre. And at that point, the danger is not only that deportations fail, it's that the democratic order itself begins to look unserious. That's where we are now. Not at the end of the argument, but at the point where failure in one area of policy starts to poison faith in the entire system.